Hello, 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 and hello again. This is Otherlinks. I'm Mary. I give a conservative take about the world around me. Feedback is immensely important. Feel free to reach out, and the sources for you to do so will be provided for you. All right. Also, I have a Shopify link. Again, that's my spiel here. Interested in customized T-shirts, tumblers? You have suggestions or ideas that you would like to see on my shop? Feel free to reach out about it to me, and the best way to do so is through email. All right, so some of the audio platforms that I have, I'm on Spreaker, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, just to name a few. All right, in this episode, I'm going to focus in on my thoughts about the aspects of horror films and its implement on our culture. Here we go. Okay, so my goodness, the aspects of horror films on our culture is something else. It's quite interesting with the aspects of how it started to where it began, and I'm just really merely speaking from what I understand and then what I've seen. And y'all, feel free to reach out to me if you want to add in on to the conversation. And the best way to do that is email. All right, so that whole B-movie atmosphere where, again, as I said, and I think that the movie Iron Giant, oddly enough, but it's just interesting how that all works out, where there's subtle adult themes in children's animation, and in Disney, with their bullcrap, they just went left field to push agendas, but that's not the subject matter here today, whenever you listen. But there's one scene in The Iron Giant where, what's his name? The little boy, I'm trying to remember his name, but the little boy, he's sitting there, is watching this little mystery science movie, and it's the whole trope where it's the scientist and then the damsel, and then they make witty inside humor that adults would understand, but it'll just go over the head of a kid and be like, oh, okay. And then you get all this goofy, wacky stuff going on with that, where there's attack from the creature of the Black Lagoon, attack of the 50-foot woman, attack of this, attack of that. But then, as I mentioned, before, you get people like Vincent Price to twist that map a little bit. And so with him, he was more centered around the macabre. And so for a lesser extent and purposes, you see, more of the gore within that. But going back to thriller suspense, Alfred Hitchcock and Rod Serling really had their that stamp of approval on that. And so what I mean by this here is that, with the Twilight Zone here, this show was really wrapping in the realms of what could be when you go into the aspects of supernatural, crossing with supernatural with thriller. It was one of the forerunners of saying, Why don't we just merge all of these concepts together and have an anthology into, showcasing all of these concepts? And that was really something for its time and place, specifically when you're talking about, moving towards the later part of the 50s onto the 60s. There was a lot of change and awareness that was going on at that time. Instead of overtly talking about these issues, most of the time it was presented in a way, all the time really, it was presented in a way that was, unreal, to where it makes subtle comments about it. And then also the aspects of the ideas of tradition and the ideas of modernity was really showcased a lot in these. And the object of moral will and the object of the moral code of everything was really showcased a lot in these shows. And I think a really good example of that is in between, I think the most iconic or the most well-known episode is the one with William Shatner. And then there's the one that it is known, but not as to the greater grandeur. When you ask somebody about the Twilight Zone and they say, you ask somebody, hey, what episode do you know about, or something, if they are interested in the show, or if they know about it, or anything like that, Peach or something. They'll probably either say the one with the gremlin or the ghoul, the airplane, or they'll say the one with the pig face, the Pygmalion pig face here. Well, not Pygmalion, but the pig face. And there you go. So, I'm going to add that in too. So, these concepts, they really hone into the aspects of the fate and the will of humanity in a modern world. Now, William Shatner in the episode with he was in other episodes, but this particular episode when he was flying, it really merges the question about the aspects of mental health. And so you can see this showcased a lot in a lesser extent, or and you can tell that they took inspiration in a lot of other television shows and movies, and with the aspects of the Twilight Zone, because the Twilight Zone really opened the floodgates for all of these things to explore. And so, going on to the aspects of beauty and imagery, beauty is really in the eyes of the beholder. It really merges the concept of what is the implement, or what is the perception of reality. And I think that SNL, back in its heyday when it was really, really good and they were on point, all the actors and the comedians, or so, they were really on their game at this time. And so there was a sketch where Norm Macdonald was in the scene, and other talented actors were on the scene, and Pamela Anderson was the guest host. And so Molly Shannon was, the pig face and everything, and she was trying to convince them that, her look, which is the piggish, gorish kind of look, is the, hey, that's the just look. But they're like, what are you talking about? It's, undoubtedly true that she is very attractive. And so that's bending the knee at the aspects of, hey, that there is standards for beauty. And so telling these things in a thriller, sort of suspenseful way really gets the conscious going into the aspects of thinking about things in another point of view. And then you get other, shows like The Outer Limits, and then you get shows like the Night Gallery and so forth. And they really play and they twist with those things. Now with Alfred Hitchcock, my goodness, this man, he was really something else. Because he really understood the aspects of the cinematic touch to implement the story that you're telling. And so, Psycho, and there's one, Strangers on a Train. So many things under his belt. And then that you can really see how he compelled the inspiration of understanding how details really highlight or don't, or they really help to amplify what you're talking about. So case in point, Psycho. Now, the scene of Psycho, which everybody understands and knows for the most part, is when you're taken into the shower scene. And I think Janet Lee, Jamie Lee Curtis's mother, all that. When Janet Lee is taking a shower, see, and then that really is pivotal to the aspects of a lot of horror films, a lot of horror, big names in horror. I'm sure they took a lot of inspiration of that because, understanding the aspects of when you're in that atmosphere, or you're in that point of taking a shower or winding down, you're at your most vulnerable. And then here we go. We're on this really on it's sort of like a war. Well, not really voyeurism, but the way that it's jarring to where you're really taking a look into the mind frame of not only Janet Lee, but also of the Norman Bates, the killer. And so knowing that she's going to be at her most vulnerable and she would not be able to do anything but just, be in absolute fear. It's really heightened by how it's masked, how they masked his silhouette, and how the knife slowly goes up, and then how the curtains flash back quickly and abruptly. You hear the sound of it, how crisp it is, and how it just like nails, scratching, or somebody scratching on a chalkboard. And then you, even to the detail of her eye, looking the juxtaposition, or how her eye is focused, and then it's focused into the drain, and then how it's sort of like a metaphor for her soul being taken away, that she's no longer alive. And also with the overall story arc of how she's always looking very nervous and, anticipating and looking, because, to start out with, she was on the run because she was doing something she had no business doing. And that also is another element of suspense and jarriness into the aspects of when you get into the realm of horror too, because a lot of the storyline is focused around people doing something they had no business doing, and then they put themselves into a circumstance where they wouldn't normally do, or to where it can make them really vulnerable, to where they can ultimately get into really severe, dangerous situations. All right, with that being said, you when you get into a movie like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, man, that movie was woohoo something. And it's quite interesting with the aspects of that of it being banned, and that, as I said, about the Monster Mash, how it was banned in BBC, and then initially this is a wheelhouse for the the government of the people to get more publicity to this, certain movie or something. Without, are they willing participants in doing that? It's just one of those things. But going back to it, the whole premise is just very strange, and it took the layer and the aspects of horror in a different level into where, you get a movie like The House on the Left, to where these things are talking about very, very, very brutal subject matters, to where you're like, oh my God, what's going to happen next in the arena of horror. And then some people equate this as the means of getting more into the realms of the slasher, sort of paving the way for that. Now, Exorcist. Now, a movie like The Exorcist is really something else, because it is, and then you get the Omen, and all of this, specific genre. It's heightened into the aspects of really, not only, you come in anticipation. They're hoping the director or what have you is hoping that the viewer is coming in with the anticipation of the shock value, but all at the same time, it really goes into the realm of, well, maybe this possibly could happen. And then you get into the aspects of having movies like the Blair Witch Project, to where that blew the map of changing the aspects of what does it really mean when it's based on a true story. And then using that as a marketing ply or pull or gimmick into getting people wanting to see the film. And so also it is really interesting when you get in the aspects of horror and religious undertones into the aspects of how is that, really prevalent into the aspects of people's lives. Because that's an undertone that is very noticeable, specifically, when you go into the aspects of slasher films, as it's labeled, the genre. How the worldly or mainstream view of religious beliefs, and then it's being overtly perverted into the aspects of bringing awareness of what these exactly mean into the undertone of the moral code. Now, what do I mean by this? So, the big name hitters, on top of the Exorcist of what they were talking about and exploring in the aspects of religion and the aspects of Satan and demonic spirits, and then the aspects of the Omen too. Now, the big heavy hitters, moving on to the big heavy hitters, when you get into, Nightmare on Elm Street, you get into Halloween. Before then, these two, Halloween is the first, and you get into the Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. List goes on. Now, for the most part, the undertone themes that is presented in these movies has a lot of allegories in it, to where it's making commentary about the aspects of youth culture and degradation. And so it's no mistake that, and then it's even more prevalent in the aspects of a film, the film franchise of Friday the 13th, that specifically the murderer will wait until it to kill and to attack when these camp counselors were engaged into acts of the passion persuasion, if you get my drift. And that in itself is going along with the undertones of the aspects of the moral code, with the, when you get into the overall grandeur of things about the subject matter in this tome. And that was the whole reason in Friday the 13th for Voorhees' mother to attack and to get Jason to go after these teenagers, is because that's in itself how Jason died. They were, engaging in passionate acts, and they just had this discourse they just had no care to see what was going on because of that act. Now, when you get into a movie like, Halloween is quite different, but when you get into a movie like Nightmare on Elm Street, there's a lot of, if you really look at it, there's a lot of religious undertones that are really prevalent into the aspects of the first film. The way crosses are being presented, the way Tina specifically in her disposition with the aspects of morality and sexuality, and how that undertones each other, and the aspects of how, again, it's going back into Freddy Krueger's origin line, where his mother was a nun herself, and she committed an act of sin, and because of this, she didn't want her child, and she was seeing her child, literally as a demonic presence, and that's something along the lines of how what you perceive and what you feel can manifest itself into bringing about evil, in this case, or good. And then, you get back into the aspects and the perception of Freddy Krueger's daughter, and how she is the link to break that cycle and make things anew for something that's much better. But, it's very interesting how these are how these overtones are interlaced in the aspects of horror, because it gives a new layer into the depths and the understanding of where things can be turned when it goes into the cultural map of horror films, or of the subject matter. Because, in itself, talking about, religious topics, sorry about that, talking about religious subject matters is something that is really, in itself, to certain communities can be polarizing. But that's something that in the right arena, if you're willing to hear it, it can be addressed in the right way. Or it can be talked about, without, but I guess that's wish fulfillment. It can be talked about in a different way, or at least get the conversation going here. And so, when you move on to the aspects of, a movie like Halloween, when the most prevalent aspect is, for the most part, it centers around the aspects of a child not getting what they want for Halloween, and then maybe they're possessed by the mask that they have on or something, and it just goes on this spree of this slashing. That in itself gives a whole new level to the aspects of horror and talking about different subject matters when it comes to youth and culture. And then with the aspects of more modern movies, when you get into Jeepers Creepers, which was based on true events, you get into Drag Me to Hell, and I'm thinking Drag Me to Hell is about that this is the right movie, but or stuff like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's this movie where it's talking about the aspects of really the subject matter is about eating disorders, and that crafting that in a way to where it really makes the main character even more vulnerable, and then also making social commentary. And then when you get into the aspects of movies like The Purge, and that list goes on here, they really heighten, and I've seen this overline consistency over now in the arena of horror. A lot of it has to do most of the time, if they're not just rehashing what's already been done, or there's supposed to be a reboot or something. Most of the time it's just centered around social commentary. And I'm not a fan of Jordan Peele, but a lot of his work has to do with mainly for the consensus. When we get The Purge, you get 28 Days Later, stuff like that. These zombie films, or even if we go humorous, Warm Bodies. A lot of it has to do with social commentary. But Jordan Peele, even though I don't really like him, and it's just really unfortunate with the aspects of having that activist mentality, or I would say militant mentality. But you give credit where it's due. He does get that well with the aspects of really implementing himself and making a lot of social commentary about the world around us. When we get into the aspects of us, and everything else, subject matters really, delve into that very deeply, when it goes to religion and all kinds of other commentary. And so, really, and I'll end on this, with the aspects of how horror films are implemented into our social, the pop culture, social culture. I think the reason why they're so popular, because they in themselves is a marker into the aspects of how fear and what you would do in those situations are really driven, and a lot of the focal point into the storyline. And that's something to consider too, and to think about. All right, so I would like to know what you all think. Feel free to reach out to me. So this reaches the end of the Harboring Light. Tune in, turn up, and absolutely take care out there. Bye-bye for now.